There we go. All right. Okay, so as I said, I'm Kat with Ontario Streams, and we'll be talking about our fishes of the Oak Ridges Moraine tonight. I know we've heard one land acknowledgement, but I would also like to acknowledge that the land that Ontario Streams works on is a traditional territory of many First Nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and many bands of Chippewa. First Nations peoples, they were the first stewards of the land, the first caretakers of our land. And hopefully tonight, as we learn a little bit more about the fish and the water that we have near us, we'll consider how we can also be stewards for the environment around us. I do see a hand up, and I just want to remind people that we will put questions in the chat. And if we do have time at the end as well, we can probably go a little rogue and do some unmuting and just have more of an open discussion too.
Yeah, Kat, we're just letting you know that you're in presenter mode.
Oh,
again.
I'm in presenter mode too. Oh,
I don't know why it's doing it tonight.
It's getting us good. Let's see, hopefully that's better. You know, like almost 2 years in, right? And still some things we just can't get right. So a little bit more about Ontario Streams. We are, as I said, an environmental charity. So we are a pretty small one, and it's likely that you haven't heard of us before tonight. So I'll give you a little overview of the kinds of things that we usually work on. We do a lot of habitat restoration, especially focused on our aquatic or near aquatic habitats. Last year, we collected 186.5 garbage bags from our sensitive riparian or near water habitats. We planted 6,365 native trees and shrubs, again, very close to our waterways. 45 habitat enhancement structures built. I know that's kind of a vague term, but I'll show some photos near the end of the presentation to showcase what exactly a habitat enhancement structure is. We also removed 26 detrimental in-stream blockages. Again, we'll see those near the end, but sometimes we've got issues with natural debris, sticks, branches, whatnot, gathering in a river, and it starts to block fish movement. Last year, even though we were still living through COVID, and I know we saw at the beginning, Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust Association also was able to host some in-person events safely. So we saw 557 community volunteers come out to our events last year. And then we saw another over 1,000 through our virtual events like this one. And we removed 0.7 hectares of invasive species, particularly common buckthorn or European buckthorn. And that's an invasive species, came over from Europe, causes some problems with our native species with over competition and giving not so nutritious food to our local wildlife. So we got quite a bit of that out of the way, and then we're able to plant those native species to fill in the area again. For Ontario Streams, we're usually thinking about these three fish. We've got the red-side dace, which is a little minnow, and we will see a little bit of that guy tonight. But I will preface that they have not recently been found in the Holland River. We've also got Atlantic salmon, which is a fish that has been considered locally extinct for the past over 100 years. That's due to our first settlers coming in and overfishing, as well as doing a lot of industrialization, habitat destruction, and pollution. Lastly, we've got brook trout, which are not listed as at risk. However, they are really sensitive. So they're a good indicator species. They're able to let us know when a habitat is really starting to degrade or not be able to sustain this kind of life. We will talk a little bit more about brook trout because they are found in the Holland River. So how do we know when fish are in an area? Basically, we go out and do some sampling, and there's many different methods to sample for fish and understand where they are, how many of them are there, and get that sort of data. One thing is electro fishing. And in this photo, we see a team of our summer staff using a backpack electro fisher. And so that's the backpack that we see on the person in the middle. That has a battery in it. And then that battery is connected to that yellow pole with a circle at the end. And basically that battery just shoots an electrical current, just a very low level pulse into the water. And when that pulse goes through the water, it will temporarily stun a fish. And then one of the two in the front on the sides, one of those two staff, they have nets and they can actually scoop the fish up, put them in the bucket that our staff at the back has, and then we are able to identify the fish, take some measurements, and then put the fish back in the water. And it's only stunned for a few seconds, just long enough for us to scoop them up. It's a very easy way, effective way, and safe way to identify and monitor fish. Next up, we have seine netting, and seine is just a kind of net. And with seine netting, you can do this from the shore, you can do this from a boat, but basically you're using a net and pulling it through the water and then pulling the net out and evaluating which kinds of fish you caught. And that's often used for bigger systems compared to a river system where you're working in meters or so at a time. We also have minnow traps, and this is something that anglers use as well to collect bait, but these just sit in the water, collect minnows, and then you've got them. And I believe for our BioBlitz that we are partnering with Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust Association for in May, we are going to be doing some minnow traps. And then finally, we have eDNA, which is environmental DNA, where you can take samples from the water, and those water samples will have little pieces of DNA in there. And then you take those to the lab and you can actually use those samples of DNA in the water to determine which species might be present. It's not always the best way to see how many species might be there or how many of a single species might be there, but it's good for getting an overarching kind of snapshot of the different species. And when we are trying to identify a fish, there's a lot of different things that we want to look for. So let's see, I was gonna pull out this laser pointer here. The external anatomy of a fish, hopefully many of us have seen a fish before, but fish can look very, very different from each other. There's not really one standard looking fish. But here we've got a largemouth bass that will look at some of those features. So a big thing to start with on a fish is the size and shape. That's usually going to give us a good idea of the family or the group of fish that this belongs to. In this case, with a largemouth bass, they are a medium-sized fish that we would find here in the Great Lakes. And they are kind of oval shaped or round, kind of cylindrical overall. Other sorts of fish sizes might be laterally compressed. So that's something like Dory from Finding Nemo, one of those tangs. They're pretty skinny and tall, kind of like your hand. We also have laterally compressed, which is nice and flat. So that would be something like a flounder, though flounder from the Little Mermaid is not a very accurate rendition of a flounder, I have to say. Maybe they'll get that right in the live action movie, but real flounders are not as cute as our animated ones. So usually shape is a good place to start. Next up, we want to start counting those fins. We want to see which kinds of fins they have and what they look like, their general shapes. So up top, we have the dorsal fins. So when we think about whales or dolphins, they have that dorsal fin too. Dorsal refers to the back, though dolphins and whales, of course, are not fish, so not our topic tonight. We've also got the pectoral fin, which is kind of like what we would think of as arms on a human, and those sit right on their sides of their body for the most part. We also have pelvic fins, which are on their stomach, on the ventral side of the fish, that's opposite of dorsal. Then we have anal fins in the back, and then we have a caudal fin or a tail. So that's what most people know that as. Next up, we are going to be looking at scale size. So a largemouth bass has medium to large size scales, but we will see some fish that have really teeny tiny scales that might even be hard to identify just with the human eye. We might need a microscope or a magnifying glass to really look at their scales. On the other hand, we might see fish with very large scales, like the size of our fingernails. So that's something like a carp or a goldfish, which we'll see a little bit later. And sometimes fish don't even really have scales at all, and we will see an example of that today too. Next up, we're going to be looking at mouth shape and size. So here with this bass, the mouth is right at the very end of their body. So with most humans, if we stood against a wall, usually our nose is the first thing that would touch a wall. In this case, with this bass, the last thing to touch would be its mouth. So we call that terminal, right at the very end. However, some fish are a little different. Some have subterminal mouths, which means, like us, their nose would be the first thing to touch a wall. Others have mouths that are right on the bottom too, so kind of where our chin would be. We also want to look at mouth size. So with a largemouth bass, we know that they have a very large mouth. And when we look at fish, something to determine the size of their mouth relative to the rest of their body is we generally look at how far their mouth goes in relative to their eye. So in this case, the mouth reaches basically to the middle or end of their eye, and that's an important feature to identify a largemouth bass. I will say though that there is going to be a lot of variation between one fish to another, a juvenile to an adult. So identifying fish is not always an easy thing. Tonight, as I said, is going to be just a kind of an overview. We'll check out some of the main species and families that we have here in the Holland River in order to prepare us for that BioBlitz coming in May, where we will be sampling some fish, trying to see what we find along the Oak Ridges Moraine on the Holland River. So there's so many more fish out there. And if you are enjoying what you've learned tonight and you want to learn more, I would recommend doing some more deeper learning through some other courses. So we have the ROM Fish ID course, Royal Ontario Museum. They run a wonderful course. This year it's happening in April and May. It's a few days long. You totally get immersed in knowing all of the fish that we have here in the Great Lakes, which is 150 fish. And tonight we are just doing a small sample of those, but hopefully you'll learn something new about the fish that you do have close to you, and that will inspire you to care more about that local environment. Again, I just covered these things, but those factors that we really want to look for with Fish ID: shape, fins, scale size. In addition to the scale size, there are different kinds of scales. But again, that's a feature that would need quite a more in-depth look at under a microscope or maybe a magnifying glass. So we won't really focus on those tonight. But then we've also got mouth shape and size. And then I do want to note that color is not always a great identifier. Here on the right, we have two rainbow trout, both of them the same species, but you can see just how different they look. That top rainbow trout is a male in its spawning colors. So many species of fish, the males will develop really bright reddish orange colors when it's spawning season. And then below that, we have a female who is obviously much smaller and not as fun colored, unfortunately. So generally, color is maybe an okay idea, an okay factor to think about, but for the most part, it's not going to necessarily be conclusive. Now that I talked about all these different features, how do we use these features to actually make an identification? Well, many people, scientists, researchers, anglers might turn to something called the dichotomous key. And basically, it's like a questionnaire that helps you go through and narrow down what sort of living thing you might be looking at. So this can be taken beyond fishes, plants, anything. You can use a dichotomous key. This one here is one that I found online through the Michigan Sea Grant. They have a really wonderful program for classrooms. And this is an activity you can do with students to help learn about a dichotomous key. So up here to start, the first question that we're going to ask is how many dorsal fins does the fish have? We said dorsal fins are the ones on the back. So the options in this case are 1 fin or 2 fins. So when we look down 1 fin, we can go all the way through and identify basically down to family or subfamily level. I've circled a few of the families that we're going to be talking about tonight. And that's just to show you how far away they are from each other on the dichotomous key. So when we look at just families, it can be fairly easy to get to that level. That family, they have common characteristics. They are different enough from other families that we can often tell the difference between a catfish and a trout. We can usually get there on our own, but beyond that, down to species level is when it can get a little more challenging. So we're not going to go too deep into that tonight. I'm going to say that one more time, but we are going to learn more about these families and try and get down to some of the more common fish that we see down to species level. And here just to see the other side of that dichotomous key, when we have 2 fins, again, we're able to build it out until we find the family of the fish we are looking for. From there, there are so many more detailed dichotomous keys out there that could bring you all the way down to that individual species. But this is just an easy overview for some students and anyone else who wants to learn. As I said, we are focusing on the Holland River watershed today. So the species that we are going to cover, the families we are going to cover, are ones that are known to be found in the Holland River based on recent fish sampling data. So that's why we're going to talk about this list that we've got here. I've bolded the ones that we're actually going to get to tonight. I've left out a few, a lot of them just trying to pick the most common ones that we might find out there. So you can see it's a pretty long list though. And it's nice to see that we have this much diversity here in the Holland River. And beyond that, here in Ontario in the Great Lakes, like I said, 150 species. So to start with the first family here, we have trouts and salmon. The scientific name for them is Salmonidae. And here in Ontario, we have 14 native species of salmon and trout and 5 non-native or introduced species. Those introduced species are ones that are very favored for sports fishing and recreation. So they are generally salmon and trout from the West Coast that have been brought here, stocking in our Great Lakes and our local rivers. They have an adipose fin, which I didn't mention in that picture of the largemouth bass because largemouth bass don't have adipose fins. An adipose fin is this little fin that's kind of on their back, closer to their tail. And this adipose fin will be different colors for different species of salmon or trout. And that adipose fin can actually change color too between juveniles and adults. But in general, an adipose fin, that a salmon or a trout has one, we know that. We can get down to family almost entirely just by knowing that. And then from there, an adipose fin is a good next step to get down to species. Salmon and trout generally have some sort of spotted pattern, and that pattern will change between juveniles and adults too. But again, it's consistent more or less at the different stages. It's just as they grow, they go through a process called smoltification, which is just when they become a smolt, which is kind of like the teenager of the salmon. That's when they usually begin their migration, and that's when they need to change from these patterns as a juvenile, when they lived in a river environment. They need to get different camouflage to move into their lake environment. So that's when they start to see that change in their patterns. They have pretty small scales compared to other fish, and they have a scale that is just right at the base of their pelvic fins, which is special to them as well. Two of these species that we have here in the Holland River are the brook trout and then rainbow trout, which I'll talk about in a moment. But here we can see that brook trout, it starts pretty gray as a juvenile, and it has lighter spots on it. But as it grows and becomes an adult, it ends up a more dark green or brown color with lots of speckles that are usually white or cream or orange or yellow, as we see in the picture on the right. And as they get ready to spawn, that's when they really pick up a lot of that red color. We see the adipose fin right here on the juvenile and again over here on the adult. And so that is again a key characteristic of a fish in the salmon or trout family. And another thing about these brook trout is that they have a large mouth. So we can see on this picture here, it does extend to the end of their eye. And if we are to look inside the mouth of a brook trout, they will have really pale gums. And looking at the gums is another way to identify down to species level with our trout and salmon. So some have very light colored mouths and some have very dark colored mouths. There's some that different species will look almost the same on the outside, but as soon as you open their mouth, that's how you can tell which species they are. A brook trout adult can grow somewhere between 25 to 65 centimeters and getting up to about 6.5 pounds. As I said before, the brook trout, they are really sensitive and they lost a good chunk of their population back in the late 19th century due to industrialization, pollution, as well as introduction of the brown trout and rainbow trout, which were stocked for recreational purposes. These days, though, we have lots of organizations who are trying to bring back the brook trout. Ontario Streams, we do more work with bringing back Atlantic salmon and restocking Atlantic salmon, but we do lots of habitat enhancement work to bring back the brook trout, as well as quite a bit of advocacy. As you may have heard about the wastewater treatment plant in Erin, they are looking to release effluent into the local rivers that will be a little bit warm. And brook trout, as I said, very sensitive. They need really cold water to survive. So there might be implications of having that warmer water come into this brook trout stream. So as Ontario Streams, we are working with the Coalition for the West Credit River and trying to raise awareness and make sure that proper environmental protocol are going through. And I do have this video of a brook trout pair spawning. So here we see in the middle, that is a female, and then in the background on the right is a male. So we do see the male has a little bit more of that red coloring, and we see a lot of action happening there. So that's just a quick example of brook trout in the wild. Then we've got the rainbow trout, and as I mentioned, they are non-native to this region. They are from the West Coast, and they've been brought here as something to promote recreational fishing. They are one of the most widely introduced species to Ontario. You may have also heard them called steelhead before, and that's one of the subpopulations of the rainbow trout. In this case, we again see lots of patterning on them. They are more of a silvery color, and they often have that little pink stripe running along their body, which is kind of how they got that term rainbow. It's something that's really iridescent, and it brings out that rainbow color. Like the brook trout, the inside of their mouth is also pale. So that's another feature that is specific to the rainbow trout when we're trying to identify them. Here we see their adipose fin as well. They have a little bit of spotting on theirs and a little bit of a black outline, which again is special to our rainbow trout. They do not have any outlines on their actual spots. We do see similar looking salmon and trout who have black spots all over their body with a pale outline. So this is, again, these just plain black spots is how we identify rainbow trout. The average length of one of these is usually around 53 centimeters. So a pretty large size fish. And that's one of the reasons that they are stocked is they're kind of feisty and they're a bigger fish to try and catch. Now we'll switch gears to another family, which are the minnows or the Cyprinidae. And we have a lot of minnows in Ontario, 36 native species plus 3 non-native established species. So established means that they are here and they're reproducing. For the non-native species of trout and salmon, some of them are established, so they're able to breed here on their own. Some of them are not, so they are constantly stocked. But in this case, we've got 3 that are here and happy and continue on here in our Great Lakes. As I said, 36 different species. The ROM course, they do a high level overview course, and then they also run a minnow specific course. So you could spend several days just learning about the minnows in Ontario. So for the most part, it is a very expert level need to know on these identifications for minnows. Overall, they have 1 dorsal fin. That's a common feature. Their caudal fin or their tail is usually forked. They do not have teeth. And the native species that are here in Ontario, they don't have any spines in their fins. So spines are, as many different animals have spines, things like a porcupine, a hedgehog, those are a defense mechanism for humans trying to handle them or anyone trying to eat them, other natural predators. So we've got a video here of some creek chubs, so you can see what they look like here in the water. But I'm sure many of us have seen minnows, and they all look like small little silvery fish. But I will show you that there's quite a bit of variation, though even with that variation, it's not always easier to identify them. And on that note, we have a bunch of dace, and these are 4 different kinds of dace. However, they all look pretty similar. There's many, many kinds of dace here in Ontario. Dace is just another word for a small fish. They're just a kind of minnow. And we have these 4 here, very similar characteristics, but 4 different species. I do want to note the reason the red-side dace has a star, as I said before, it's not currently found in the Holland River, but I just wanted to show it for comparison. It is here in our Greater Toronto area, and it is endangered, so it does really need our help. So it's good if we get an idea about what it looks like so that if we are ever out there and we see one, we know that it's a very sensitive fish that needs our help. Up on our top left, we have a black-nosed dace, and though the other 3 kind of also have a black nose, the features here that we are looking for in the black-nosed dace to identify it is looking at where the upper lip reaches in comparison or relative to the eye. So we are seeing that the upper lip here, which is already so hard to tell because these are very small fish, but their upper lip is basically runs to the same level as their eye. Also not obvious in this photo or with any of these 3 of the 4 fish is that they have little barbels on the sides of their mouth. So it's kind of like a little whisker, not very long at all, like a catfish. We might think of those whiskers or barbels. These ones are much smaller. These guys here do have a dark stripe across them. Usually it is black. However, during spawning season, it turns much more orange. These guys are probably the biggest of the bunch of these 4, growing to be about 8 centimeters long on average. With the long-nosed dace, I think it's kind of the goofiest looking one of these 4. So if you see a pretty goofy looking dace, it's probably the long-nosed dace. And that's because it has this longer snout and the upper lip is lower than the eye. So again, not a great picture to see, but it's much shallower compared to where the eye is. The adults, they don't have a dark stripe like the other 3 on this slide. However, when they are juveniles, as younger little fish, they do have a dark stripe. So it can be pretty complicated when they are younger to try and tell them apart from these other 3. They do have a much lighter colored belly, usually white or silvery compared to the others. However, like the other three, during breeding season, they can develop a lot more of that orange and red coloring. They also have little barbels on their mouth too. They grow to be about 7.5 centimeters, so just a little bit smaller than our black-nosed dace. Down here, we see our northern red-bellied dace, and we can see from its name, it does have a red belly, but of course, that's really more prominent during spawning seasons, and otherwise, we're not going to see that really bright pigmentation. They have a much smaller mouth, though, of these four, and we can sort of see that in this picture. It is very tiny. It's nowhere near their eye, and it's just, even if it was closed, we probably wouldn't see it at all. These guys have two darker bands of color on them, as well as a top band that's mostly spots. So that is kind of a better tell compared to the other three fish here with that line of spots. That's not going to change as much compared to the changes that we see in coloration in the different fish at different times of year. This guy is also the smallest of the bunch, measuring at about 5.5 centimeters on average. Lastly, our red-side dace, they are known for having a very large upturned mouth. So we really see it go almost all the way into their eye. When their mouth is open, it is very large. They have this bright red stripe on their side during the spring, but otherwise it's not as bright outside of that spawning season. And they measure at about 7.5 centimeters in. So more or less the same size as that long-nosed dace. But I think this collection of fish really does put it into perspective at how hard it can be to identify different minnows at different times of year, at different life stages, even though they do seem to have these really characteristic stripes. They do kind of all blend together. So it does take quite a lot of practice to get to a point where you can identify minnows. I don't even think I'm at that point. And it's always something we can just keep learning and keep practicing. So hopefully you will come out to the BioBlitz and test these new skills and knowledge that you're learning tonight. Now we'll switch gears to common shiners and spot-tail shiners. So already compared to those dace, we see a little bit of a change in the body shape. These ones are a little bit more deeper bodied. So we're seeing kind of more distance between their back and their stomach. So they're getting a little bit wider. With the common shiner, we are seeing a mouth here that goes right to the front of their eye. So it's a kind of a medium-sized mouth. And they have some large scales. So on both of these, we can see their scales compared to back here. It's not quite as easy. We see that they're much smaller and they're almost blending together. So first off here, we're also seeing that difference in scale size. We see not very easily on here, but another identifying feature that we can look at on fish is whether their dorsal fin and their pelvic fin start at the same spot on their body. So if we drew a line right from the top of their dorsal fin to the beginning of their pelvic fin, we'd have a straight line. In some fish, it's staggered. But here with the common shiner, we are seeing right on top of each other. These guys here are about 9 centimeters long. And an interesting fact about common shiners, which I think is pretty cool, is that the males, they will build a nest for the female to lay the eggs in, and then they will defend that. And we will see another 2 fish today that do that as well. So it's pretty interesting that we have fish here in the Great Lakes who practice a little bit of parental care, because we often think of fish as not caring too much about their babies, not the same way that we see birds taking care of their eggs, but some fish are out there doing the same thing. Next up, we have this spot tail shiner, and hopefully you're able to see that spot. And that is how they got their name, right on that spot on their tail. However, I'm going to preface this many times today, but that spot or any of these coloring features are not going to be prominent on every single individual. So it's not always the best way to identify this spot tail shiner. And as we can see on this common shiner, they do have a little bit of a darker coloration near the base of their tail as well. But this guy's a little more vibrant. These ones are a little more elongated, so not as deep-bodied as the common shiner. We see a more rounded snout on this little guy and a subterminal mouth. So that's looking at their nose being the first thing to touch a wall and their mouth being below there. They're about 7 centimeters long. And these spot tail shiners are actually quite abundant in our Great Lakes, and they are really important for our food chains because they are prey for many of our larger fishes. So we want to make sure that these populations stay healthy so that we can keep having lots of stability in our food chains. Then we have the creek chub, and the creek chub, they are one of our bigger minnows that we have here. And they are often considered a top predator, if you can imagine, when other larger fish are missing from an ecosystem. They generally are on average about 10 centimeters long, so it's hard to really picture this 10-centimeter long fish taking over our food chains and eating all these other little minnows and whatnot, but that's kind of their role here. In terms of identifying features, they have a black upper lip or a darker upper lip that we see a little bit here. A very large mouth that does reach to the front of their eye. They also have little barbels in the grooves along their lips, which are, again, are going to be hard to see in this photo. But another feature that we should note here is that their tail or their caudal fin is a little bit more rounded than we've seen so far with other minnows. It's a little bit more lobed, so not quite that fork that we've seen in many of the other fish tonight. And they also have a dark spot on their dorsal fin, so a little bit hard to see when their fin is down like that. But we've got this video as well to show some of their interesting behavior. And that little red-side dace that I showed earlier, that little endangered guy, they lay their eggs in the nests of creek chubs because creek chubs are another one of those fish that do parental care. They take care of their eggs in the nest. They guard those little eggs in the nest. So in this case, the red-side dace are laying their eggs and getting some free babysitting. So there's quite a pretty important relationship happening here. So because those red-side dace are endangered and they have such specific needs for breeding and spawning, we also want to make sure that the creek chub are protected and remain healthy so that the red-side dace can finish their full life cycle. So here we've got a video of the sneaky red-side dace laying their eggs where the creek chub are. So they kind of all gather in, cause some a little commotion, and then they will spawn right there with the creek chub. And we can see those red-side dace, they're really picking up those spawning colors. We really see that red because it is spawning season. All right, and now to switch gears again, we have common carp and goldfish. And these are both part of the minnow family. However, both do not belong here. These are some of our non-native species that we have. The common carp is considered the first invasive species of fish to come here into North America. It was introduced in the mid-1800s, and they have done a real number on our aquatic vegetation. So all of our plants that we have, like wetland plants, marsh plants, swamp plants, these common carp, they will dig around in the soil and the substrate, the sand at the bottom of these bodies of water. And they are looking for, often looking for little aquatic insects that live in the soil and sediment. And as they dig around looking for their food, they end up pulling up the roots of these plants and really destroying a lot of this vegetation. They still, as I said, they belong in the minnow family. So they have a lot of those, well, they do have those same features of the minnows. These guys have, both of them have very large scales. All right, we can see in these pictures on the left that they are basically the size of our fingernails, covering the common carp at the top and the goldfish on the bottom. Both have very large and deep bodies. They're pretty hefty little guys. And the common carp, they have 2 barbels on each side of their mouths. However, the goldfish do not have any barbels. The carp will be on average about 37 centimeters, but they can grow up to 100 centimeters. And the goldfish are on average about 19 centimeters, but can grow up to 40 centimeters. The goldfish, of course, have been introduced by humans with people who no longer want their pet goldfish. They see a pond, they say, my pet goldfish would be very happy out in nature to continue the rest of its life. However, we don't realize that a goldfish will grow as large as its container. So when we have them in a little fish bowl, they're going to only be a few inches. However, when we put them out into the wild, they've got so much space out there that they just keep growing and growing. And like I said, they can max out to be somewhere around 40 centimeters long. And there's been many studies here in the Greater Toronto area pulling out these goldfish and trying to understand just how they got this big and how they got there in the first place. As I've said a few times now, our juveniles, our younger fish, they will look pretty different from our adult fish. So on the right, we do have some juvenile common carp, and as juveniles, they are pretty hard to identify compared to a lot of our other minnows. They just look pretty small and cute, like many of our other local fish. However, we know that they don't belong here, and we need to figure out how to best manage them and get them out of here. And to look at another family that we have are our sticklebacks, or Gasterostidae. And these guys are very interesting looking fish, and probably one of the most interesting fishes that we have here in Ontario. We have 4 native species of them, and they have between 3 to 9 spines along their back. And as we've seen so far with most of the fish this evening, their spines have been together on a fin, on their dorsal fin. However, in this case, they're isolated, so they are not attached to anything in a bigger sense of being a fin. They just are spines along their back. These guys are scaleless, so they don't have the scales that we normally see on a fish. And a narrow caudal peduncle is another identifying feature. And basically that just means this little piece that connects their main body to their tail. It's pretty skinny. That's their caudal peduncle there. These guys, the Brook Stickleback is the specific species of stickleback that we have here in the Holland River. And they are very small and a little bit deep bodied. And as I said, they don't have any scales. These ones usually have 5 spines, and they are usually all the same length. So we can see along the back here that they have those spines, and those spines are used to deter predators. So something like another fish or a bird that might try and scoop one of these up, those spines act as a defense mechanism. As we've seen in some other fish this evening, these ones here also build nests. And I will just note that we see this little red spot here. That is just a wound that the fish had, and it's not a color or marking that we need to be worrying about here. Sometimes fish, just like us, they can get hurt out in the wild. But next up, I'm going to show a video of the stickleback actually building a little nest, which is just really interesting here. And we see they're pulling up little pieces of vegetation, digging a little hole. And this one here is, I believe it was one in captivity. This is not from the wild, but still pretty interesting to see their movements, those really big eyes, and how they are able to dig through the vegetation and the sediment And then they just hang around and keep an eye on their little nest. Another family we have here is the sunfishes and basses, also known as Centralidae. And we have 10 native species and 1 non-native species of this family. The non-native species is the orange spotted bass, but it is pretty rare. They have their common trait across the board are 2 dorsal fins, and they are actually attached and they look fused into one. So it's a little bit backwards to think that they have 2 when it looks like one. The first one is spiny, so that has that defense mechanism built in, and the second one is soft and it has rays instead. And rays are still those little pieces of cartilage, but they're not as sharp as those spines. They have 3 to 8 anal spines, so that's along their ventral side and their bottom. They've got thoracic pelvic fins and a rounded soft dorsal fin. So quite a few features that are part of the bass family. As we remember that drawing earlier this evening, here is our largemouth bass. They are deep-bodied and medium size, usually around 30 centimeters or so long. They have 10 dorsal spines. So if we were to sit here and count all of the ones on this little fin that's kind of hidden, and again over here also hidden, that would have 10 of those spines. And then they have 3 anal spines. So down on this fin here, we would count those first 3 would be pretty sharp and not so fun if we picked up a bass. And then the rest of those are still hard, but they are not necessarily going to puncture us. Of course, the largemouth bass has a large mouth, so it comes almost to the end of the eye, the posterior end of the eye. So a very large mouth. We also see the variation here in the juvenile. So they have they still have more or less that striping, just a little bit more mottled as well here. And then we've got a pumpkin seed. And if you've ever been fishing, this is likely one of the few fish that are easy for beginners to catch. I have only caught 1 fish in my life when I was probably around 8 years old, and it was a pumpkin seed. So pretty easy for anybody to catch for a first timer. This pumpkin seed, they are smaller than the largemouth bass, though of course it's hard to compare that to a juvenile largemouth bass. They also have 10 dorsal spines. So if we sat here and counted these, that would be 10. And again, 3 anal spines down here. They do have a smaller mouth though, so that's going to be our key feature. If we had a juvenile largemouth bass, their mouth still goes almost to here. So on our little pumpkin seed, it barely touches the front of the eye. Pumpkin seeds also have this little marking, their opercular flap. That's the piece of skin, I guess, scales that covers the gills of a fish, kind of are over near where their ear would be. And it usually has this white outline and a dark spot, generally orange. They have a soft dorsal fin back here. Again, we're seeing little spots along the way. And that's a good characteristic of the pumpkin seed, is many, many spots that kind of turn into stripes when we get closer to the head. We also have sculpins or Cottidae here in the Holland River with 4 native species in Ontario. They are they have a pretty large head. When we think about other fish, it seems like a small portion of their body is their head. But when we look at sculpins, their heads take up more of their body, or more of their whole body, I guess. They have large pectoral fins. So we see right here, they are big and kind of look like a sea monster almost. And they've got a large mouth and they have 2 dorsal fins. But in this case, we see that they are more separate than back here with the pumpkin seed. So this is 2, but they're fused, where this is 2 separate. Again, the first one is spiny and the second one is just soft rays. The specific sculpin that we have here is the mottled sculpin, and they are very, very good at camouflaging. So it is not very easy to find them. Here we did find one this past summer while electro fishing. And again, we see their head is a little squished, but they've got these huge pectoral fins, the spiny section, the spiny dorsal fin, the soft dorsal fin. And again, from above, we see those really big pectoral fins. They are scaleless as well. However, they do have some patches that have fine prickles on them. So they wouldn't feel the same as that scaleless stickleback. They'd feel a little bit more like sandpaper in some spots. There is a invasive species that looks a lot like Sculpin, and that would be the round goby. So these are pretty prominent invasive species here in Ontario. And like you can see in these two pictures, they look pretty similar. So it is hard to know the difference. You can see size is generally a factor here, but the really big feature that we're looking for is a round goby has a fused pelvic fin. So when we look and turn them upside down, it's just one big pelvic fin, whereas on our round goby or on our sculpin, it's two separate pelvic fins. So they're not attached, they're almost on different halves of the body compared to this round goby with just one big pelvic fin. We see a note here that says do not use as bait. So there's some campaigns out there making sure that we are not buying round goby and using them as bait, because that's how they've spread, is that anglers will use them as bait, and at the end of the day, if they haven't used all the bait, the live bait, they will pour it back into the body of water. And these round gobies are pretty happy to be out of a bucket and into a new body of water. So they have spread pretty quickly. However, if you are out and about and doing some fishing and you use a minnow trap and catch some round goby, then you are not to put it back in the water. So that's generally the protocol around round goby. And then again, another new fish that we have, or new family of fish, is suckers, Cassotomys, and we have 14 native species here. And big features that we look for are this one big dorsal fin, kind of in a triangle shape compared to some of the other dorsal fins we've seen that are a little more rounded. And we also really want to take a look at their mouth. They have a sucker-like mouth, which is how they've got their name. And they have thick lips. And those lips, the different species within the family, they are different shaped. So these are 5 different species right here. So we can see that those lips covered with those little bumps, those papillae, are used to identify the different species. So I believe up top here, this is our white sucker, who we will go into on the next page, and we'll see just how different their mouths can be, but this is the one we kind of want to focus on for the next page. And we see again, they've got that, but this can also be a little bit tricky to identify if we're not very strong on our ID skills just yet. But white suckers, they are one of the most common fish and widespread fish in Ontario. So if you do find a sucker, it is very likely a white sucker. So that makes things a little bit easier sometimes. They are slightly deep bodied, so they're not too deep, but they're also not very skinny. They're very cylindrical. And the key feature here is that their snout overhangs their mouth. So we're seeing their mouth right underneath rather than the terminal mouth. And they are pretty cream colored underneath. They range on average about 31 centimeters long. And they have very specific eating habits because of that downturned mouth. They eat a lot of smaller little things in the ecosystem, things like aquatic insects, plants, crustaceans, things like little crayfish and things like that. So we see in this picture, this video here, them eating in the river. So got the white sucker, and you can see its mouth is moving around, trying to pull things off of the rocks or between the rocks. So it's very different than the other fish that we've seen so far tonight. All right, so those are the big families that we will find here in the Holland River. And as I said, of course, there's so many more, and I will suggest some resources at the end. But hopefully that's given you a bit of an overview of some of the families of fishes and the species of fishes that we have here. Kind of as a next step segue here is, if you are interested in going out and looking at fish, there are some things you need to know and some regulations you need to follow. So firstly, when you are working with any living thing, any wild animal, as humans, we should always try and limit our interactions. So we don't need to be handling it for a very long time, whether it's a fish, whether it's a bird, any sort of living thing. We're causing the interference right now. So it's best if we, for the most part, can leave wild animals alone. If you are handling a fish, ideally you're only handling the fish underwater. So if you've caught the fish, you'll just keep holding it underwater, check it out. If you're doing catch and release, say goodbye. If you are collecting the fish for yourself, then take it away. If you do need to take a fish out of the water, then you really shouldn't be keeping it out of the water for more than like 30 seconds, right? It needs the water to breathe. That's why it has gills and we don't. So if you do need to grab a quick photo, whatnot, very quickly put it back in the water. You also need to be aware of the different products you might have on your hands. Things like sunscreen, lotion, bug spray can sometimes be transferred onto the fish or other wildlife. Things like frogs and turtles really don't like what we put on our skin. So it's, again, a good idea to either use gloves or, again, make sure that you are cleaning your hands with just water, making sure that you are not going to transfer anything to these animals. You also need permits. So as I mentioned at the beginning, there's lots of different ways to sample and monitor for fish. But in those cases, you do need to have permits. So there's many different permits that you need to go through many different government organizations to be allowed to do these things. So we've got the Ministry of Northern Development, Mines, Natural Resources, and Forestry, and that is our first stop for permits. Beyond that, if we are working in a species at risk habitat, we also need further permits from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, that's a Canadian federal government, as well as the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, the provincial government. It's also important to know your local regulations. So in order to go fishing, there are two kinds of licenses you can have. A sports fishing license allows you to take fish home for sustenance, and a conservation fishing license, it's only catch and release. So there are two options out there, and depending on what you want to do while you're doing some recreational fishing, different licenses might have different benefits for you. We've also got the Species at Risk Act, which is a federal regulation that categorizes and protects all of our species at risk, whether they are endangered or extinct. We've also got provincially the Endangered Species Act, which is very similar to the federal government Species at Risk Act, but this is just a little bit more regional. So some species might be listed federally and not provincially, or the other way around. So it's important to know on both levels there. There's also fisheries management zones. So before you do go fishing, whether you're using your sports fishing license or a conservation fishing license, it's important to do that research and understand those fishery management zones and the different times of year that you can be fishing, the different species you are allowed to be fishing, the different sizes of the fish that you are allowed to be fishing. Many different layers there to make sure that we are promoting conservation and sustainable fishing for the future. We've also got the Bait Fish Primer, which is a resource published by the provincial government that helps us understand what sort of fish like minnows are allowed to be used as bait and which ones are not. So it helps you with a little bit more of that fish identification skills to make sure that we are using the appropriate bait that is legal. Lastly, if you're going to be fishing at a conservation authority, some of them have different regulations, so make sure that you read up on those as well. On that note, now that we all know what we need to do to keep those fish safe while we might be fishing, what is Ontario Streams doing to help these local species? So as I mentioned before, we are an environmental charity. We are looking to fix up all of our local rivers, streams, wetlands to protect the habitat and the actual species at risk that we have here. I mentioned at the beginning, we built 45 habitat enhancement structures this year. And here is what one of those things looks like. So these, basically what we do is we cut down trees, invasive species such as Manitoba maple and European buckthorn, and we remove those from the habitat near the stream. Then we put these trees into the riverbanks. And we see on the picture on the left that we have this pretty big gap between the bank and the actual water. And that is because of erosion. And erosion is what happens when we have these really big storm events, lots and lots of rain, which comes down off of all of our pavement, all of our parking lots, roads, everywhere that water can't naturally just trickle through into the ground. It runs across those roads into our sewers, which are connected to our local bodies of water. And because it's a big flooding storm event, the water is moving very quickly. It's like a little power washer, and it just carves out the banks of our rivers. Unfortunately, as that happens, all of the soil and sand that used to be in that riverbank now ends up in the river, which is why we get all of that sedimentation, which is basically like when the water looks like chocolate milk. That is not ideal. We prefer water that's much more clear, and it can sometimes take days after a rain event for the water to filter through and become clear again. So what we do, as I said, we take all of this woody material and we stick it into the bank where there's this big gap. And then we attach all of those branches to the bank using airline cable. So it's just metal cable, and we just secure it into the bank so that it all stays in place and doesn't get blown away the next time that there's a big storm. Over the years, and this picture is year 1 or year 0, I guess, to year 3. So just a couple years later, we're able to see that bank got regraded. So it's got this back to this natural slope rather than the sheer cliff. And when we put all those trees in there, basically what happens is the soil that ends up in the water, all that sediment, now has somewhere to go. It can sit in all those hidey holes made by those branches and twigs, and it naturally will fill in over time, in this case, a few years. And once it's all filled in, the trees that we put in the river start to decompose as well. So it basically just becomes a new naturalized stream bank where, as we see in this picture, all these grasses and wildflowers have naturally filled in as well. So what we're just trying to do is get that bank and that river back to a natural state, or as natural as we can get it, to help benefit the whole ecosystem. Most of our work right now is done in York Region and Peel Region. So we really focus on the headwaters, the really tops of our rivers in the Greater Toronto Area, because if we enhance those headwaters where the water starts and makes its way all the way down through the GTA, we're making sure the water starts as great as possible and really refresh the water in the Greater Toronto Area. And we slowly over the years have started working our way a little farther south so that we're catching up and just continuing to really work with all of the urbanization that we're seeing and really try and keep our local systems as natural and healthy as possible. Then we've got these detrimental blockages. I said we removed 26 this past year, and we can see on the picture on the left, there's just this big clog of branches and trees and twigs and all of this. And though that occurred naturally, that's something that happens after a large rain event. We've got all of this flooding happening on the land around our rivers. And as the water moves along the land, it can pick up all these branches and bring them into the water. But then it creates a clog and fish can't often get through this. So we come through and we very slowly and carefully, hand by hand, remove all of these little pieces. If we were to come in and do it very quickly, then we could release a lot of that soil and sand and sediment back into the water because that blockage is holding a lot of that. So if we don't want to see very quick chocolate milk happen, we will slowly take these pieces out. We also do quite a lot of planting native species. This past year, over 6,000 native trees and shrubs that we planted across the York region and Peel region. So we are hoping this year to hit over 7,000. So these past couple of years, it's been closer to 5,000, but we're growing and climbing, and we're happy to really be enhancing these habitats. And by planting these trees, maybe we're thinking, how does that help the water? But the roots of the trees and these shrubs are able to filter the water as it moves underground, make sure that it gets cleaned and filtered before it enters our rivers. Our trees can also create shade to keep the water cool. And of course, our cold water fishes love that. And it also creates habitat for whether it's birds, squirrels, things like deers will come and eat all of these beautiful trees we just planted. But it's really great for our urban habitats to have this much more natural and native species planted here. And then we also do quite a lot of research and monitoring. So we do that electro fishing during the summer months. We're out checking to see what sort of fish that we have in different sensitive areas so that we can better inform our conservation work. And we've got our little red-side dace friend here that we are always looking for. And we work as part of a bigger partnership with the red-side dace restoration strategy team. So we are working together to try and bring back these red-side dace, starting with making sure that their habitat is healthy for them, as well as some organizations are hoping to actually start reintroducing red-side dace as well. So there's quite a lot of research happening at Windsor University right now, looking at how we can breed them in the labs to then go release them out into the wild and help that population grow back since they are very endangered here. And it's just because the habitat in the Greater Toronto area, where about 80% of their population has always lived in the Greater Toronto area, even before we were here. But that urbanization that we see now is really causing some problems. So we're just looking at how we can better help this little guy and all the other fishes that we have here. And maybe now you are wondering how you can help as well. So of course, there's lots of things. We know about recycling. We know our 3 R's. That's so important. We know to save water. Lots that we know and we already do, right? And something that we should always keep doing is learning. So on social media, we have Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So lots of ways that you can follow us to keep learning about the local fishes. Same with the local conservation authorities and municipalities, lots of resources out there. As I mentioned a few times, we've got this Bio Blitz happening in May. I will let the team from Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust Association give you the date on that one, but I believe it's mid-May, and we'll go out on the Holland River and actually practice some of these new skills we've learned. I know May is quite a long time from now, but as this was recorded closer to May, you can come back and watch this and refresh yourself before coming out to the Bio Blitz. If you are looking for very fish-specific identification resources, I can't recommend enough the ROM Fish ID course. They have, as I mentioned, some new sessions opened up in April and May. So if you're interested, just check out their website. There's Fish Online, which is a provincial government-run platform website that helps you see what sort of fish are where all across Ontario. We've got the Michigan Sea Grant, which I mentioned was the resource I use for that dichotomous key, but they have lots of resources out there. Again, they're a little more specific to Michigan, but still the Great Lakes. So a lot of things are applicable over here too. There's an application called Early Detection, and I forgot the D right now, EDD maps, and that is for detecting invasive species. So if you are out and you are doing some fishing or any sort of outdoor activity and you come across an invasive species, you're able to log it into EDMaps, and it will alert the government and help build that crowdsourced research about the spread of our invasive species that we have here in Ontario. And lastly, another 2 apps that are really fun and easy to use. We've got iNaturalist and Seek, and those are both under the same umbrella. Seek is one that you can use just to basically take a picture of any living thing, and the robots in the app will basically help you almost always right get down to at very least family, if not all the way down to species level, and that is just one of the coolest things to be alive for right now. Being able to just take a picture of some sort of living thing and know exactly what it is helps so much with like wildflower identification and things like that. So if you get out in the spring and start seeing some flowers, you can use that app and you're just that much smarter now. So I really recommend that as well. Lastly, you can support organizations like Ontario Streams. We do offer volunteering programs with school groups, corporate groups, and community groups as well. Right now, just with current public health regulations, we are only working specifically with closed groups. So in that case, it just means that you have a group of people who already know each other, and we can for sure coordinate with you and your group to run an event. We just can't do an open call for just anybody right now, unfortunately. Maybe later this spring, things will change, but as of right now, we are only booking programs through those protocols. We also, as I mentioned, are an environmental charity, and we are always happy to get donations. So we do have a profile on Canada Helps, which you can access through their platform or on our website as well. So I do want to thank you so much for tuning in tonight. I do see that we've a good number of questions, so I'm happy to help go through some of those. I will remind you that we are on social media at Ontario Streams, so you can reach out on any of those platforms, as well as there is our email, outreach@ontariostreams.on.ca, and you can connect with us that way as well. If you have any questions after the program, or if you are interested in some of our other programs, whether it is a volunteering program, or I also would like to mention that we're doing virtual programs right now for school groups, community groups. Anyone who would like to learn more about their local community can connect with us, and we're happy to lead a free program for your group. With that, I will stop sharing and go through these questions.
Thanks so much, Kat. If you'd like, I can read the questions out for you so you don't have to kind of field them both.
Yeah, really. Am I stopped now? Oh no, there we go. Okay. All right, sure. Aiden, you wanna mediate?
Sure, yeah. Thanks so much again. That was really great. Loved the videos especially.
Yeah.
So we have a few from Janet, and then there was a few in the chat as well. So let me just start from the top, I guess. So Janet Harrison asks, do they consider red-side dace as brood parasites on creek chub nests?
I don't believe they do get that terminology. I don't think it's not a relationship where the creek chub are being harmed in any sense. They're putting a little more energy into raising their own plus some extra. But I don't believe it's technically brood parasitism like we would see in different bird species, right? Where they kind of are a little mean and go find another nest and hope that they have someone else to do that free babysitting. So I don't believe that's the case with red-side dace, but it is very interesting because when the University of Windsor, I can't remember right now, but when they started doing their research, they were having a really hard time getting the red-side dace to reproduce or to spawn. And they eventually had to kind of go back and do some more research and notice that they do need that creek chub nest to lay their eggs. So what the researchers did is they had to make some 3D models of 3D printed models of the creek chub and hide them in these tanks, and that really turned on that light bulb for the red side dace in the labs that, oh, there's the creek chub, and now I can spawn. So it is a very important relationship, but I don't believe it's brood parasitism.
Interesting. That was a big note for me this evening, was learning that. It's really, really cool stuff. So another one from Janet Harrison. Have you found invasive round goby in Holland River?
I believe that round goby are very spread out across Ontario. I don't know if they've specifically been found in the Holland River, but they they are kind of everywhere, like our the zebra mussels, right? Where they just sprung up, that we're having a really tough time getting a handle on them. I know with the zebra mussels, there have been some reports that say they've kind of maxed out, but it is really hard to know. And, you know, prevention is always going to be better than coming back and trying to manage afterwards. So that key take home is, you know, make sure that you really understand the local regulations, things about those different kinds of bait, and how we can make sure that no more of these invasive species keep getting into the ecosystems.
It's a great point. Yeah, I appreciated that part of the presentation for sure. And Bay Area Restoration Council says they think the red side dace and creek chub relationship is considered commensalism. You heard of that? Yeah, not sure about that, but it sounds.
I guess it's
sounds
like kind
right.
of community based. So I think it's, yeah, again, it's not harming either to be part of this relationship.
So there was one in the chat here. Let me ask before I lose it. Gabriella Carew, are there any concerns with putting invasive trees into the streams for bank stabilization, such as seeds or live portions that could break off and flow downstream? That's a really good question.
It is a really good question. I will also, I didn't mention this earlier, but sometimes we use native plants like cedars as well. So that kind of cancels out that issue. But when we do use those non-native or invasive species, generally when we are in the stream, it's in the late summer. So it's generally before they are starting to, for the European buckthorn, before they start to get their berries or flowers. So generally that's not an issue. And in terms of like common buckthorn, it is very, very strong, and it keeps coming back again and again. So even when we do cut these trees down, we do see them sprout up again. But the thing is that when we put them into the banks, we are not seeing anything spring back up, though. It's something that we are monitoring. We're coming back year after year, looking at maintenance and making sure that these areas and these structures are doing well. And many years ago, we used different techniques, and we've since learned aren't as effective. We often, in the past, we used to do just big logs. So we would get logs donated from various sources, or we go out and take these trees and cut off all the branches and then stick the logs in the river. And we're not creating those hidey holes, those little spots for the sediment to sink in and to settle. So we have actually gone back and made changes from previous years using this new information. So I'm sure we will continue to monitor, looking for any potential issues with those invasive species. But as of right now, that's not something we've noticed.
Okay, and this is a really good follow-up one, I think, from Janet as well. Do you use live plants for bank erosion mitigation, such as red oyster, dogwood, alder, or willow for sunny banks?
Yep, for sure we do. So we have to wait until that sediment does fill in. So as we saw in that after picture where the grasses were growing, the wildflowers were growing, in that case, we would come back and put in willow stakes. So that's little baby willow trees. Willows, you can basically just take a twig and stick it in the ground and it'll just pop back up eventually into a tree. So it's kind of easy for us to do that. Later, as many years pass and the bank does really come back and fully filled in with that soil there, then we would likely come back and plant some larger and more variety of trees and shrubs along there too.
Great. And one more from Janet. You showed a slide of planting away from the river. Are you doing more plantings along the bankside to shade the river?
Yeah, so I would say last year, maybe about half of our plantings were right near the stream bank, 30 meters or so from the stream, and about half were in other locations. Again, near streams, but not necessarily right there creating shade. It's just looking at what other sort of environmental or built up features are in an area. Like often our partners with Richmond Hill, we're at their public parks. We're trying to make sure that other spaces in the park are benefiting from these new native species or these new native plantings. So again, creating habitat for other animals who might be coming near the river, but not necessarily need to be right next to the river all the time. And again, thinking about how water moves underground. So sometimes we'll be closer to the parking lots or other areas in the park where we're able to catch water moving underground, getting it filtered before it moves into the stream. So about 50-50, depending on how close we are to a stream versus a little bit farther, but still creating those positive environmental impacts.
Great. Well, that's a good answer. And I didn't see any more. Let me just take a quick peek. I think that was all, but thank you so much. I learned so much. I'm really excited for it to heat up a little bit and get outside. For those of you still on the call, the Bio Blitz that we're going to be doing with Ontario Streams is May 14th. So mark that in your calendars, and hopefully we'll get out and find a lot of these species that you talked about tonight.
I'm just going back and reading through the good, lots of comments happening in here. Oh, Janet knows me from the Toronto Zoo. Yes, I used to work there. All right, well, I'm so glad that came out tonight and we're interested in learning more. And I do hope to see you all come out to the Bio Blitz in May. I think it'll be a good chance to practice our new skills, learn a little bit more. There's going to be more beyond fish too. If fish aren't really your cup of tea, then we will be having some other different kinds of species, different experts too coming out to the Bio Blitz. So lots to learn for anybody.
Definitely. Thanks so much. And just a reminder, the webinar will be recorded. So we will follow up to all the participants with a link to the recording if you kind of want to revisit and learn some of this great stuff again.
There are some cute fish out there for sure.
All right. Well, thanks so much. And I'll stick around for a few minutes while people kind of trickle out if they want to keep chatting. Yeah, thanks so much, Kat. It was really
all right, thank
really
you.
great.
Have a good night.
Yeah, you as well.